Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's lecture, War on Record, the Archive and Afterlife of the Civil War. The event is sponsored by the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is based in the History Department at Virginia Tech. I'm the director of the center. I'm Paul Quigley, and really pleased to welcome you. The center does a wide variety of events, academic conferences, K-12 outreach programs, student grants and scholarships, and of course, events for the public like this one. Today's speaker is Dr. Yael Sternhell, who teaches history and American studies at Tel Aviv University in Israel. She's an accomplished expert on the history of the American Civil War. Publications include the award-winning 2012 book, Roots of War, The World of Movement in the Confederate South. Her latest book is right here. It's brand new. You can see how new it is. It's less than a week old. Very fresh indeed. War on Record, the Archive and the Afterlife of the Civil War. And it's a book that I and many other Civil War historians and enthusiasts have been eagerly awaiting. It's the first work to investigate in any significant depth the efforts of the federal government to preserve and curate the documentary records of the war. And this, of course, is going to be the subject of today's talk. This is what you signed up for, what you're here for. Dr. Sternhell will talk about the book for around 30 to 35 minutes, followed by a discussion with the audience. And the way that's going to work is through the Q&A box in Zoom. So at any time, you can type in your questions into the Q&A box. You could do that during the talk if you want, or wait until afterwards. We'll try to address as many of your questions as we can, and we'll wrap things up at the latest at around 1:15 Eastern US time. So just a little more than an hour from now. So I'm really grateful to you all for being with us, for spending this time with us virtually. Even though we can't see you, we're very glad to be with you. And of course, I'm especially grateful that Dr. Sternhell is able to join us from Tel Aviv. So let's give her a warm virtual welcome to Virginia Tech. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for this invitation. It's wonderful to be here, to get a chance to think about the past rather than about the present. So I'm going to first share my screen, of course, and let's make sure this is all. How is this working? Almost. All right. Paul, are you happy? Okay.
Yep, that was good.
So my book sits at the nexus of two equally fertile, albeit very different historical subfields: the study of Civil War memory and the global history of archives. Each of these fields has had an enormous impact on how we understand the past and how the past bears on the present. For over 20 years, historians of the long Civil War era have been studying intensely the various ways in which Americans understand and make sense of the Civil War. In recent years, of course, this conversation has attained a new urgency as the struggle over the public commemoration of the war took center stage in the nation's political life. Meanwhile, historians worldwide have taken on the institution of the archive and turned it from a mere resource for doing research into a subject in its own right. This approach, also known as the archival turn, takes as its point of departure the notion that archives, the seemingly static and sedate storehouses for the raw material of history, are in fact highly dynamic and malleable institutions, which, like all institutions, are shaped by a host of forces and influences. The workings of any given archive reflect the culture from which it grew, prevailing political currents, historical perceptions, as well as the particular conditions that brought it into existence, whether it's an archive of a nation state, a town, a church, a private company, a family. The nature of an archive is also determined by the people who work there, the budgetary constraints they are under, the administrative protocols they form and abide by. All of these have tangible, in fact, crucial implications for scholars. Archivists, whether we like to admit it or not, shape our research through the decisions they make, how to organize the material, how to describe it in the catalog, and most recently, of course, whether to digitize and make it available online. Archivists, rather than historians, are the first to interpret historical evidence, turning the raw records into collections or groups, creating a lens through which historians then see the material. Though they often remain in the shadows, their work has a genuine imprint on the narratives historians craft. Archives are therefore both the products of culture and the producers of culture. This applies to the Civil War archive in every respect. And when I say the archive, what do I mean here? The written records created during the Civil War are scattered between numerous repositories in every corner of the United States. So there are, of course, many Civil War archives. Still, I would argue that primacy of place probably belongs to the vast body of official records generated by the armies fighting the Civil War and assembled by the federal government in its aftermath. I spent over a decade studying the workings of this archive, from the creation of the records during wartime through the hard labor of collecting, organizing, and searching the records, and up to the process of their editing and publication. This research has yielded a book that asks and answers two questions. How did the archival record left in the wake of the Civil War figure in the long and complicated process of remaking the United States? And how did events taking place in the archive determine the nature of historical knowledge available to us about the Civil War? Put differently, how did the archive determine what we know or think we know about the war? So in what follows, I'm going to offer two examples from my book that will illustrate each of these veins running through it. But first, a word about records in the archive. The Civil War created an enormous wealth of written records. In many ways, it was the first bureaucratized war. Both armies, numbering a total of 3 million men and spread across an entire continent, generated gargantuan quantities of paperwork, which were produced, managed, and preserved by countless adjutants and clerks, the war's unsung heroes. Though it is impossible to reliably quantify this body of records, anecdotal evidence offers a glimpse into its scale. One figure: the war had brought the quintupling of federal records in Washington from 200,000 cubic feet in 1860 to over 1 million by the mid-1870s. Written records, in short, were no less essential to the conduct of the war than guns. This body of records was never coherent, centralized, or properly organized. On both sides of the conflict, some officers and headquarters followed record-keeping protocols religiously, while others ignored them completely. Records were stored usually pell-mell in tents, headquarters, and bureaus across the United and Confederate States, and were subject to every vicissitude of war. At the end of the conflict, the Federal War Department instructed officers of every rank to ship their papers to the Adjutant General's office in Washington. Some obeyed the order, others ignored it and took their records home. Confederate records, obviously, were in complete disarray. Many records were lost during the final weeks of the war when armies were retreating. Others were burnt during the Great Fire engulfing Richmond in the last 2 days of the war. Regardless, what did survive of the Confederate archive would come to play a variety of crucial roles in the post-war battles between the government and its former enemies. At first, the federal government assumed that it would find in the records evidence for Confederate involvement in Lincoln's assassination. It established a new unit in the War Department called the Archive Office, but known colloquially as the Rebel Archives Bureau. And here's a letter from that collection. It's a vast collection in and of itself, with both names, both the official name and the colloquial name. A team of officers and clerks, headed by the renowned legal scholar Francis Lieber, launched an intensive search in the records assembled across the South for incriminating evidence. Yet to Lieber's great frustration, those records never materialized, and over time, the government and the Northern public lost interest in the project of putting leaders of the rebellion on trial. While the absence of archival evidence was not the only reason for the retreat from legal proceedings against the leaders of secession, in the immediate post-war era, it was certainly an important contributing factor. Lieber was relieved from duty in 1867, and the Archive Office, once considered the government's secret weapon against its enemies, receded into the background of Reconstruction politics. This changed once Congress and the federal government established several claims commissions which allowed Americans and other nationals to ask compensation for losses they had suffered during the war. Southerners who filed claims for compensation from the federal government came from every walk of life: men and women, black and white, ex-slaves and free, Confederates and Unionists. The losses they had incurred resulted from the harsh realities of wartime, when millions of U.S. soldiers fighting across the Confederate States consumed huge quantities of goods required to sustain armies in the field and destroyed or confiscated whatever could potentially aid the Confederate war efforts. Requests for reimbursement ranged from $100 from one mule taken from a farmer to millions of dollars worth of cotton confiscated from a British trading company. Regardless of the size or nature of a claim, the principle underlying the act of filing it was that civilians who had remained loyal to the United States were owed payment for property the federal government had taken from them for its wartime needs. Some aggrieved parties acted on this proposition while the war was still in motion, turning to local military officials, to special military boards created for this purpose, and to congressional claims committees. With the end of the war, Southerners continued to press their case, appealing to every office holder, from the president down to local commissary officers. As Susanna Michelle Lee has shown, appeals to Congress accounted for an estimated 1/2 to 1/3 of the legislation passed in the 1860s and 1870s. In an attempt to systematize the process and answer widespread demands for restitution, Congress on March 3, 1871, authorized the president to appoint a 3-person board of commissioners for 2 years to consider the justice and validity of claims. The Southern Claims Commission's SCC ended up considering more than 22,000 applications for $60 million. Claimants had to prove above all else that they had indeed remained loyal to the United States throughout the war and were willing to tender their active support to the cause of quashing the rebellion. This was no easy task, as residence in a seceded state in and of itself was considered proof of disloyalty. Claimants provided written and oral testimonies by friends and families and answered detailed questionnaires about their conduct during the conflict. The commission employed an exacting standard for judging loyalty and used a variety of means to discover fraudulent claims. Unsurprisingly, 56% of the claims submitted were rejected on account of disloyalty. The onset of the claims era and the federal government's relationship with Southerners reconfigured the archive office and gave its work a new direction and new meaning. The collection of papers lying in its rooms had failed to provide the evidence required for sensational war trials. It proved extraordinarily useful when it came to establishing the Confederate affiliation of numerous individuals, companies, and properties. The 3 commissioners were inherently suspicious of anyone who had spent the war as a resident of the Confederacy and employed a variety of means to root out fraudulent claims. But in some ways, the most important resource in the hands of the SCC was the Archive Office, with its trove of incontrovertible evidence for wartime interactions between the Confederate government and its citizenry. As soon as claims began pouring in, the Archive Office got to work on the lists of names sent over from the commission. A search for evidence is being rapidly pushed forward, confirmed the chief clerk of the Archive Office to the Adjutant General in May 1871. This was highly challenging work. The volume of paper stored in the Archive Office was huge, and some records were still unsorted as late as 1879. Another problem was identifying the right individual, especially when the SCC provided only the names of claimants. If evidence was discovered, the incriminating information was assembled on special slips, which became part of the permanent record of disbarred claims. The clerks of the Archive Office located proof of disloyalty everywhere in the sprawling record of the Confederacy. So I'll give the example of the claimant Jonas P. Levy, who argued that he was owed no less than $10,000 for stores confiscated by the Union Army, since he had spent the war in Wilmington, North Carolina, merely because he had gotten stranded there on his way to Mexico, where he had large investments. Levy swore under oath that he had never served the Confederacy nor offered aid, comfort, or information to the government or its officers, and denied ever having communicated with Confederate authorities. Yet the Archive Office had located a number of letters from Levy to various government officials, including the Secretary of War, reflecting his allegiance to the Confederacy. Levy denied the allegations and claimed that his signature had been forged by a one-legged clerk named Charles Miller, who had, Levy claimed, since then died. The commissioners interrogated him mercilessly, forcing him into making a clearly preposterous argument that the original letters found in the archive office were written in a handwriting different than his own, and telling other improbable lies about his wartime life. Albert P. Tasker, chief clerk of the archive office, testified in the hearing, certifying that the papers implicated Levy were in the boxes sent from Richmond at the end of the war. The following day, the archive office forwarded additional papers pertaining to Levy, though the point was already moot. The commissioners rejected his claim, calling him a shameless traitor. Numerous other Southerners who had sworn under oath that they were fervently loyal to the United States throughout the war were confronted with documents dug up by the clerks, which bore their names and demonstrated their support, or at least acceptance, of Confederate authority. Some were on record petitioning the Confederate Congress and executive departments for various allowances or exceptions. Others appeared in the vast cachet of quartermasters, ordnance, and commissary paperwork, selling the army necessities like fodder, rope, tents, mules, and shoes. There were those who turned up on Confederate muster rolls, and then there were those who were discovered as having subscribed to the Confederate Cotton Loan, one of the financial instruments used by the rebel government to raise money for the war effort. Congress in the 1870s also continued reviewing large-scale claims, which now enjoyed the support of white Southern representatives who had retaken their seats in both chambers. A particularly notorious case was that of Southern mail contractors who had lost their jobs once the federal government stopped providing postal services to the seceded states in May 1861. Claims for compensation for services rendered before that date but left unpaid were submitted to Congress as early as 1871, and bills for payment were passed starting in January 1872. The Archive Office provided proof that 1,133 claims for the same lost wages had been submitted to the Confederate Post Office Department, and that the Confederate Congress had passed laws to pay them. The office was also able to produce evidence that particular states had paid mail contractors out of their own budgets. The issue remained alive for over a decade as Southern congressmen continued to advocate on behalf of their constituents. On January 12, 1874, Robert Vance, a Democrat from North Carolina, introduced a bill in the House of Representatives to compensate certain mail contractors in the state. When learning about this development, the staff at the Archive Office wrote the Secretary of War immediately, reminding him that these claims had already been settled by the rebel Post Department. Always using suitably official language, but nevertheless nudging the Secretary to act, they asked that he alert the relevant officials about the evidence discovered in the archive. Yet this was not enough to settle the matter. In February 1878, Alfred Waddell, a Democrat from North Carolina, submitted a bill along the same lines. He enjoyed enthusiastic support by none other than John C. Reagan, the Confederate Postmaster General, who had returned to Congress representing Texas. Reagan testified that the Confederacy instructed postmasters to settle their accounts with the United States and to return the money and postage stamps still in their possession. After the debate, Representative Edwin Willits, a Republican from Michigan and an experienced prosecutor, well-versed in the usage of archival evidence, retrieved from the Archive Office several official documents showing the Confederacy had assumed the debts of all postmasters to the United States. The highlight of his findings was a proclamation by Reagan himself, instructing postmasters to retain the money in their possession, as well as a document showing that he had personally reimbursed the contractors for their financial losses. Reagan claimed he had forgotten all about the payment and tried to salvage the situation by suggesting that the bill be sent back to committee. The Archive Office celebrated in its files with preserving clippings from pro-Republican newspapers, celebrating Reagan's humiliation and lauding the archive's great utility to the government. The history of the War Department's Archive Office embodies the seemingly abstract principle that archives both shape reality even as they are shaped by it. While the government's Confederate Archive determined the dynamics of the claims office, the impact flowed both ways. As the stash of papers lying in the archive office emerged as the Treasury's best and often only defense against fraudulent claims, the archive was also reconfigured in several important ways. The documents that had been considered prized possessions during the immediate aftermath of the war, the correspondence of senior figures in the Confederate government, pieces of evidence pointing to crimes and conspiracies, all lost their significance by the 1870s. The records that mattered now were those that had been considered useless before: tedious financial paperwork and mundane communications of the Confederate government with citizens from all walks of life. Quartermaster vouchers, receipts, records of the auditor's offices all assumed a new and unexpected import. The claims era brought a new calculus to the work of preserving and mastering the Confederacy's written record. Okay, so that's sort of avenue number one. And now to avenue number two, to the question of how archival processes determine what we know about the past. And I'll just take a drink of water. While War Department clerks were searching through the financial transactions and muster rolls of the Confederacy, records that could not be used in the legal wrangling between the federal government and Southerners largely lay dormant. Veterans writing histories of the war begged for access, but for all sorts of reasons, they were usually denied. In the mid-19th century, the United States simply did not possess a national archive open to historical research. Unlike France, which threw open the doors of its National Archive in 1792, the archiving of federal records was an exercise in chaos. Records were strewn all over Washington, often in no particular order, and were in constant danger of being lost to fire, flood, rodents, or thieves. Though eventually the War Department would allow some researchers the privilege of coming into its archival bureaus, in the early years after the war, the records were largely out of reach. Even well-connected celebrity generals were frustrated at the government's refusal to make public official records and demanded that it take action. In 1875, William T. Sherman complained at the opening of his memoirs that no satisfactory history of the war had been published, nor should any be attempted until the government has published and placed within the reach of students the abundant materials that are buried in the War Department at Washington. By that point, though, perhaps unbeknownst to Sherman, the pressure by veterans to access the records had borne fruit, and the federal government was making initial steps to publish a selection of its archival records. In May 1874, Congress allocated $15,000 to begin the publication of the official records of the War of the Rebellion, both of the Union and the Confederate armies. Considering the job at hand, this was a minuscule sum of money, but it was enough to set the process in motion. As might be expected from a still Republican-dominated Congress, less than a decade after the war, the project's official title was determined as War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. Clearly, archiving records and editing for publication were hardly the same thing. One might even argue that from an archival point of view, they are the opposite. But the federal government never created a brick-and-mortar archive of Civil War records. Instead, it chose to create an edited compilation, a portable archive, if you will, which has attained a position of unmatched popularity and authority among historians. The OR, as it is known, has been used by virtually any scholar writing about the Civil War. This applies not just to military historians, but to scholars studying this momentous event from any number of angles. It is impossible, for example, to imagine the history of emancipation without it. The compilation lies at the heart of historical knowledge about the Civil War. So what is the OR? For those of you who have not had the chance to work with this source, a few words of explanation are in order. The compilation consists of 128 volumes, numbering roughly 1,000 pages each, and divided into 4 series, the largest and best use of which is the first, which numbers 80 volumes and covers what is called active operations. The documents filling these pages are printed copies of the official records produced by both armies, reports by officers, correspondence, orders, telegraphs, Union records appear first, followed by Confederate records. There is no commentary except for the occasional footnote. Events follow one another in quick succession, taking the reader from one setting to the next and introducing them to the voices of hundreds of Civil War commanders. The result, as practically anyone who has worked with this source can testify, is an incredibly immersive source, which often gives the reader the experience of being transported back in time. And in some ways, that is exactly the problem. The OR can easily be mistaken for an exhaustive compilation of the government's Civil War records. In hard copy, its sheer bulk is pleasingly daunting. Online, the wealth of results generated by almost any keyword search amplifies the allure, seemingly obviating additional research in the voluminous manuscripts stored in the National Archives. The subtitle, "The Official Records," hints that these are in fact all the official records of the United States and Confederate armies. And yet, making the OR entailed an enormously labor-intensive process that took place over a quarter century, cost millions of dollars, and was determined by the personalities of the bureaucrats controlling the process, the agendas of the politicians funding it, and the anxieties of the veterans contributing to it. Even more elusively, the making of the OR was grounded in contemporary understandings of history and historical practice. Make no mistake, when we use the OR today, we are still bound by ideas of 19th century military bureaucrats about which historical events mattered and which did not, whose account of the war was worth making public, and whose could stay in the dark. The most important figure in the making of the OR is a virtually anonymous officer by the name of Robert N. Scott. Born in Tennessee, he had moved to California as a teenager and joined the Army in 1857 as second lieutenant of the 4th Infantry. He was wounded in June 1862 and was out of commission for 2 months. Upon his return, he was appointed acting assistant adjutant general and then became senior aide-de-camp to no less than General Henry H. Halleck, the U.S. Army's master bureaucrat. After the war, Scott filled a number of administrative duties and wrote hefty legal documents, which means that when coming into his new position as compiler, Scott possessed 3 essential skills. He was an experienced military bureaucrat who understood how information flowed through official channels. He was historically aware and valued the preservation of original documentation, and he was an active legal thinker. Scott was appointed in December 1877, more than 3 years after Congress had begun to fund the project of compiling and publishing military records. Prior to his appointment, the work had moved along under other War Department bureaucrats, but none possessed the vision nor the zeal required to undertake the Herculean task of first reining in the unimaginably vast quantities of paper, filling up entire buildings in Washington, and second, editing them into a usable compilation. Scott took charge of the project under the auspices of a newly organized administrative unit called the War Records Office. Though Scott would not see the process of compilation through, he died suddenly 10 years later, some said from overwork. In his tenure as head of the War Records Office, he laid down the infrastructure that allowed the work to continue even after his early passing. Unsurprisingly, the first question Scott tackled was selection. Within weeks of his appointment, he decided to leave out several classes of documents. 1, applications for appointments. 2, contracts. 3, charges of disloyalty. 4, claims. 5, tenders of troops. And 6, unsolicited advice. Critically, he also suggested excluding the ordinary routine business of the bureaus and departments. Scott reflected on his work only rarely, but his 1879 annual report to the Secretary of War offered a glimpse into the demands placed upon the staff as it took on the task of sorting through the records. The work, Scott wrote, was moving along steadily, but the amount of labor involved in examining the massive records stored in this city, in making judicious selections from them, and in the verification of the copies made can hardly be appreciated by those not immediately connected with the War Department. Scott never said more in writing about what the work of making judicious selections actually meant, or about how he and his aides determined which records deserved to see the light of day in a published compilation and which would remain in the War Department's messy storage spaces. One way to gain some insight into the selection process is to examine the raw records and observe which documents were chosen for publication. Luckily, the War Records Office imprinted each document selected for copying with a stamp reading War Records 1861-1865 copied. 2 different stamps were used, but neither the stamp nor any other notation on the original records says when a document was reproduced and by which staff member. Since the compilation process proceeded chronologically, and since compilers were credited in individual volumes, we know who was in charge of putting each volume together and sending it to the printer. We know that Scott compiled the first 26 volumes and prepared enough matter for an additional 10 volumes published after his untimely death in March 1887. We know this because he still received credit as compiler. But we don't know whether he or one of his deputies were going through the originals and determining which ones would be copied. Finally, many of the records marked as copied do not actually appear in the published compilation. Someone, somewhere along the way, decided that they did not meet the criteria for publication, but we do not know who, when, and why. So with these caveats in mind, let's look at some of the raw records. So the sample I chose is 200 pages from the letters sent book of the Adjutant General of the United States Army in the months January to May 1862. The handwritten pages in the letter book contain roughly 800 orders, dispatches, and telegrams, most of which are run-of-the-mill exchanges about the daily life of the Army. But routine as they are, they provide a genuine reflection of war making. The Adjutant General's office was the central nervous system of the Army. Its letter books, therefore, embody the complex and sprawling nature of the Civil War, as well as any written record can. Even in this small fragment of documentation, the Adjutant General is on record addressing a wide variety of subjects involving a diverse array of actors, humans and animals, generals and privates, soldiers and civilians, men and women, black and white. Letters were addressed to posts, headquarters, and bureaus spread from coast to coast and ranged from hurried one-line dispatches to longer, carefully phrased letters. Okay, so what did the War Department staff copy? Among the records that ended up in print are some obvious choices. Dispatches announcing the forward movement of the Army of the Potomac on March 10, 1862, which signaled the beginning of the Peninsular Campaign. A dispatch to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, dated March 13, 1862, written 4 days after the first Battle of Ironclad Ships, one of the war's most dramatic and iconic moments. It is hardly surprising that Scott and his team gave preference to moments of high drama, to military action per se, and to officers of high rank who made decisions and shaped events in the field. These were the records they considered historically valuable the records considered historically valuable by the bureaucrats and by the OR's intended users. And who were the intended users is a different question, which I'll leave for another time. So, that's interesting enough, but probably more interesting to see is what the War Department bureaucrats chose to leave out of the compilation. One class of uncopied records are those that deal with the interactions between the military establishment and civilians. Scott actually understood that there was more to war than armies and designated room in the 3rd and 4th series of the OR for records generated by state governments and federal bureaucracies connected to the armies. But this small sample of the letter book includes intriguing and rich documents about the complicated relationship between the army and a large variety of individuals. Compilers, being laser focused on the battlefield, did not consider these historically valuable and did not include them in the edited compilation. I'll offer just one example, a message dated April 22, 1862, and addressed to Major General Nathaniel Banks, commanding the Department of the Shenandoah. And it reads, Major Henry S. Turner has just returned here from the neighborhood of the Plains, Fauquier County, Virginia, and reports an excitement there on account of outrageous rapes committed there by a party from Geary's camp. Geary is Colonel John W. Geary, as it is said consisting of 2 soldiers and a Negro upon 2 highly respectable white women named Garrett, a widow, and her young daughter. The document ends with an order by the Secretary of War to conduct an inquiry and bring the culprits to justice. Now, sexual abuse in the Civil War is notoriously underdocumented. And even when its traces do appear in writing, the explicit word rape is rarely used. The fact that this document was deemed unpublishable exemplifies just how different the notion of historically valuable held by the men who made the collection was from that of the compilers later, of the compilation's later users. Another conclusion I've drawn from comparing the published and unpublished records gets to the very nature of war making. Reading through the 1862 letter book brings into sharp relief the extent to which the raw records offer a different sense than the published volumes. The majority of the records inevitably fall under the rubric of mere routine, because in a 4-year war, the day-to-day workings of an army are mostly the stuff of routine. Compilers of the OR consciously obscure this fact by publishing those records that they called carry on the narrative of military operations, while leaving out others that convey the mundane realities of war on and off the battlefield. The boredom, the pointless movements, the unrelenting, back-breaking labor that went into keeping 19th century armies in the field is imprinted on every page in the raw material still stored in the archives, but is largely lacking in the published compilation out in the world. So we're almost at 35 minutes. I'll stop here. There's clearly a lot more to say, but I guess that's what the book is for. I hope these 2 examples give a sense of what we gain when we treat the archive as an actor in its own right, rather than a mere repository of old records waiting to be found. And I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. The questions are already starting to come in through the Q&A box on Zoom. I encourage you to type those in whenever you like. And we'll get started with a question about whether there were efforts to recover or copy records in private as opposed to official governmental hands as part of the OR.
Okay, so there was a massive and extremely complicated and elaborate effort to get records held in private hands into the War Department. There's a whole chapter devoted to that. This process had a huge impact on the final makeup of the OR. And again, it's something that I had to leave out of this talk, but it takes center stage in the book. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question to get started with, and it sounds like the message is go and buy the book, and you'll be able to learn much more about the effort that the federal government made to acquire those records that were in private hands. The next question comes from a practicing historical researcher who talks about how much they've been looking forward to your book, and this talk only heightens their excitement for reading it. So thanks for the presentation. And then the question is, those of us who focus on African-American history are well practiced in excavating Black experience from often racist records. So can you speak about how the racism of those who created and subsequently organized and shaped the archives manifests in the Civil War archive? And that's already a big question, but there's a little bit more. What historians of archives and historians in archives can do to work ethically and accurately with this legacy of white supremacy.
Right. So I talk about that too. The people compiling the OR are a group of white middle-class men who are preoccupied with the concerns of white middle and upper class men. And so the OR effectively excludes African Americans. They appear as informants, as guides, always nameless. I've never seen the name of an African American appear in the OR, though, you know, maybe there's something there, but clearly that's the rule. They are referred to in common parlance and never by their actual names. Women are excluded, and working class Americans are excluded, because anyone who was high rank enough to actually pen a document during the Civil War and have it be entered into the official record was and they're not always middle class, but we know that there is a close relationship between class and rank in both Civil War armies. So the perspective of soldiers, rank and file, the perspective of African Americans in any of the many roles they played in the Civil War, and the perspectives of women are basically entirely absent from the compilation. And, you know, I think a model for how the compilation can be used, but in a way that is ethical and historically responsible, is Thavolia Glimp's work on emancipation, because Thavolia is a heavy user of the official records, both Army and Navy. There's another series, which I don't get into, which was compiled after the Civil War armies. And she has been able to extract just incredible historical facts and meaning from these two compilations. But she does so while paying close attention to sources written by African Americans about African Americans in a way that is not derogatory, as the OR does. And so the OR is one source that she uses, but it's part of the kind of the larger picture that she weaves in her work, which I think, you know, is as good a picture of emancipation as I think we'll ever get. So you know, that's one way of doing it. And of course, there are the raw records, which are in the National Archives. And you know, I think historians of Civil War experiences are so used to the OR, and it is just so damn convenient, right? You just go online and search, and it feels like it's all there, but it's really not all there. And so I would advocate for giving the manuscript records in the National Archives a shot, if you can make it there, of course. Travel to the National Archives is not easy or even doable for everyone. But if you can, I would say at least go into the raw records and see what there is in there that these late 19th century bureaucrats just did not think was important enough to go into the printed compilation.
Yeah, and you nicely answered another question that at least two viewers are asking, which is how can we access the records that were left out? And it sounds like the message is go to the National Archives.
They're there. They're there in manuscript. Some are microfilmed, you know, waiting to be discovered. Some researchers do work with them. I think it's overstating it to argue that researchers have relied exclusively on the OR. That's plainly untrue. But I know in my own work, I kind of, my point of departure is the OR, and at times I haven't gone beyond it. And so my urging is to join the ranks of those who go beyond it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that raises an interesting question, I think, about how digitization of primary sources has changed the way historians work. How has that played out with the OR?
Well, I mean, the OR's digitization has really given it a new lease on life. It was actually close to unusable before it got on. First, it was digitized on CDs. That was, I guess, already in the 90s. And then came the first fully online versions. Before that happened, actually, archivists in the National Archives were deeply unhappy with the OR. And I go into all of that too in excruciating detail. My epilogue is actually about and is based on interviews with 20th century Civil War archivists. And they kind of tried to save it from oblivion because it was so hard to use. But this was in the 60s and 70s, and they didn't know digitization was coming. And then when it came, I really think that it did bring the OR to the sort of scholarly world of new generations of users, and has made it even more appealing, more seductive. I think the attention that what we pay the OR, I really think we should start paying everything we use. And in some ways now everything is compiled, right? Because every archive decides which collections go online and which don't. We often know very little about this process and what gets left out. And, I'm not encouraging everyone to become an archival historian. I've sort of become obsessed with these questions, and, I'm pretty deep down that rabbit hole. I'm not saying everyone should, but I think there should be studies of all the major collections that historians of the United States use, and I think that whenever you're doing work with an online or any kind of edited collection, just kind of do a little bit of due diligence and try to find out whether what you're actually looking for hasn't gone online and wasn't even cataloged or even conceived of as a kind of record that you might use. I think it's really hard to overstate how important cataloging and description is for the ways in which we use archival records, both hard copies in brick and mortar archives and online. And so I would, I think that's one way maybe also to break some kind of deadlock that some historians are feeling vis-a-vis African-American, certain aspects of African-American history, which are not as well documented as we would want them to be, is to think about whether the material is there, but just not cataloged in a way that would be useful to us.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting, and it's slightly different from the cataloging question. But one facet of this I became really interested in reading your book was the question of indexing, and this is a nice theme in your book that maybe you could elaborate about the importance of how they decided initially to do the index and what that meant for users of the archive.
Right. So the index is a whole different kettle of worms. Okay, so the index mattered to OR compilers enormously. In the OR, and this goes to the question of intended users that I saw popping up in the Q&A, the OR was meant first and foremost for Civil War veterans. And that was the audience, and it's explicitly articulated in the documentation of this project. Now, that also included historians and compilers, especially Scott, were absolutely thinking about future students of history, as he called it. But veterans and students of history were the same people in the late 19th century. And so the index is basically close to useless for modern historians because it includes the names of every single person who appears in the OR, but It doesn't include themes. It barely includes places. The whole thing is organized in such a 19th century way that honestly, if we didn't have keyword search in our online era, it would have gone out of use. I mean, people would just not have the patience to, go through the excruciating process of extracting information through the index. But indexing was a whole task that OR compilers devoted themselves to, thinking that this really would be the core of the project, because every veteran who would see an OR series in a local library, and the question of where do the OR volumes get sent and all of that is also in the book, and what are the politics behind that, would first and foremost go and look at the general index and try to see in which volume they appear. And so there was a very particular mindset behind indexing, which sort of reflects on the project as a whole and what purposes it was meant to serve, and how remote these purposes were from what we conceive of today as the purpose of our profession.
Thank you. Another question regards later wars. Like, did the experience of curating this particular collection of records influence how the US government dealt with future wars?
Yeah, so there were this is not the only compilation that the U.S. government has published. Through the 19th century, Congress, because it was trying to make up for the absence of a brick and mortar archive, and because politicians knew that other countries have them while the U.S. cannot get its act together and open a national archive. So many historical series were published for the Revolutionary era. There was a foreign relations series, also quite massive. And then later in the 20th century, they were considering creating similar series for 20th century wars. And in fact, they were greatly disparaging the work of OR compilers, because it seemed like they were so out of step with what by the 20th century had become the historical profession. And so the OR both, I think, came across for later generations of archivists as a huge success, just by the fact that that they got it done. At times it seemed like they would never get it done. But also like a failure, because it so soon after it was finally published, which is, first volume came out in 1880, the last volume in 1901. By the early 20th century, it was already seeming somewhat obsolete. Now, it doesn't mean that historians didn't use them, and historians used it excessively, and they rave about it. There's some great quotes from Douglas Southall Freeman about how, this is what makes the Civil War so easy to study, the existence of the OR. But military historians were already becoming unhappy with it pretty early in the 20th century.
Great, thank you. Couple of questions that I'm going to kind of join together a little bit here. First of all, this is more of a comment, actually. One attendee is pointing out that, of course, you're saying that what made it into the OR is by no means a complete, comprehensive record of all the documents. And this person is pointing out that what's in the National Archives, even though it's more complete and comprehensive, still is shaped by the concerns and priorities of people who donated the records and collected them and gathered them and so on and so forth. So that's still limited. And then the question that another viewer is asking is about your kind of method for finding the documents that did not make it into the published OR. He has a great phrase: where did you focus your search for those dogs who did not bark in the night? How did you do that on a practical basis?
Okay. So look, the historical record is incomplete. The first chapter of the book actually traces the the creation of this archive. And the chapter's title, I think, kind of gives it away, an archive made and unmade, because I sort of trace the processes of the creation of records, yet the simultaneous disappearance of records, the just incredible losses during the war, and then losses continue after the war, and all sorts of accidents and incidents across the US, where officers are still carrying their records with them into hotel rooms where they're staying 10 years after the war. So I think in that way, this is what we do as historians, and I think we need to come to terms with it, that there is, at least, until the mid-20th century, there is never a complete record of anything. I don't even know how to think of a complete record, how to define such a thing, whether such a thing ever truly exists, whether in our day and age with over documentation, we have a complete record. It's a question I don't quite know how to wrap my head around. I think that for the Civil War, we are pretty fortunate, all in all, because the official records are only one element of the broader corpus that we can work with, right? Even for African Americans, we have tremendous historical content in the WPA narratives, in interviews, in letters, in such a wealth of documents, again, compared to earlier periods. And, this is something that, of course, every Civil War historian knows, but maybe is worth repeating in this context, that it was a war in which, I don't know, 80–90% of the soldiers were literate, depending on how you calculate it, but there was no military censorship. So, I think all in all, the limitations of the official records, and when I mean the official records here, not the OR, but the official record of the war, the complete body of records that has survived the war and is accessible to us, can be made up for with the use of other records. And I think historians have been doing that to great effect for many years. It's an enormously creative and innovative historical field. So, I think there are ways to get around it, but with, of course, the usual frustration that, we can never really know, right? There are always these question marks that we're stuck with.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the WPA interviews, and I was reminded, those are the interviews with formerly enslaved people in the 20th century, recording their memories. And I was reminded of how common it is for historians to point out the, inadequacies or distortions of those kinds of records. And I think the real service, or one of the services you've done for us all with this book, is to point out that, we need to ask the same kinds of questions of the official records as we have always asked of the WPA interviews.
Right. I mean, that's so interesting to hear you say this, because this is something that's constantly on my mind, right? Everyone, or not everyone, I'm exaggerating, but many scholars who use WPA interviews have this footnote, outlining all the problems with this collection and the analytical work done by historians dissecting its imperfections and distortions, et cetera, et cetera. But we never do that for official records, right? The official record is just facts, but the WPA interview are the distorted memories of an 85-year-old woman in South Carolina. And, both are distorted in all sorts of ways. And actually, my next project, kind of my next step in thinking through these questions, is to take apart the idea of official, and to dig in the official reports dig into official reports and try to think about them as personal narratives, almost as a literary genre, rather than as just the factual laying out of things the way they ostensibly happen, because that is plainly untrue.
Yeah. Exactly, and hopefully after today things will change. Maybe we'll be a little more skeptical about the official records. Hopefully, a different kind of question next about the physical records that remain in the National Archives. Are the paper archives in a state of sufficient preservation that we don't have to worry about them, literally crumbling or falling apart in the coming decades?
Well, I'm not an archivist, so that's in some ways above my pay grade. I think the National Archives is good about has been good about microfilming and is now digitizing, and I think Fold 3 is doing a lot of that work, and there are grants going in between these two organizations, as far as I understand. Though again, this is not something that I am fully informed on. It's better paper than the one that we use today. But of course there are the dangers of ink fading and papers crumbling. And I think that's true in the National Archives, and I think it's true in local archives, which I think are in some ways still very promising for historians of the South, historians of African American experiences, to actually go and find out what is the state of records in small local archives where they may be disintegrating as we speak, and we could be the one salvaging them. I think, yeah, these are very worthwhile questions to ask.
Absolutely. So a question that's been on my mind is about the public perceptions of the official records. You mentioned earlier that, the users, the creators of this archive targeted were mostly veterans, not professional historians, the people who tend to use them more today. And in the book, you talk about the thousands of copies that were sent out, often via congressmen, to veterans and just members of the public. Have those sets of the official records survived? Do they continue to have any kind of public profile that you're aware of? Does the average person out there know about the official records today?
I mean, that's a good question. I wrote this book for historians. It really is a kind of a conversation with the field. There's a story that a historian that I really admire, W. Fitz Brundage at UNC, likes to tell about the OR whenever whenever he has to weigh in on this project, which is something that he's had to do a number of times in all sorts of capacities. Then he tells the story of growing up in the Shenandoah Valley and having the local library own a copy of the whole series, and him sort of having this fascination with these volumes. And I think that as long as local libraries were still a place where people came into and read books in, that was true. I mean, I think certainly in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, aging veterans, their children, historians used the OR volumes that were spread far and wide in local libraries across the United States. I think today it's a source for historians, but also for history lovers who care about seeing the evidence in their for themselves. I just think that the online version is just so accessible that once you get a sense that it's there, then you'll use it. You do not need to go and look at the library. Though I have to say that I've gone through in various points for this book, for my first book, I've gone through whole volumes, and it's quite an experience. In some ways, though, this goes to what I was saying earlier in my talk. It's almost too much of an experience, right? Feel transported in time, and you kind of lose a critical distance that I feel is important when we do historical work, and especially when we read through primary sources. So I've become suspicious of my own infatuation with the OR.
Do you own any of the hard copies yourself?
I don't. You know, Joe Gladhar, also from UNC, once tried to hook me up with a whole set of OR that some guy he knew in North Carolina owned and would sell me. And I was just like, Joe, there's no way that I can transport this back to Tel Aviv. I mean, I think I'm just gonna, you know, stare at your entire series, which is in his beautiful home in Chapel Hill, and you know that's it for me.
Very good. We have a question from someone who works as an archivist. And of course, as you've explained, you touched on this in the talk and the Q&A, you know, this was not created by professional archivists by any means. It was former soldiers working in the War Department.
Right.
But do you have any thoughts about the work modern archivists and archives are doing to be more transparent about interventions on records, as well as undertaking retrospective redescription projects in more modern times?
No, absolutely. I mean, I've developed immense respect for modern archivists. I read their journals. They're fantastic. The theoretical interventions that I have relied on are those crafted by archival scientists. The field of archival studies sort of owes its beginnings or owes its origin, its philosophical origins to two great French philosophers, Foucault and Derrida, who need no introduction in any forum. But I honestly have found the ways in which archival scientists who come from archival studies and have background as working archivists, the ways in which they think about archives. And I think that is it's a challenge. I would not want to be an archivist today because I find the work of archiving the vast quantities of documentation accumulating every nanosecond to be absolutely overwhelming. But I know archivists are working to develop methods for archiving in our postmodern world. And I know that they are rethinking and redescribing, and there's a lot of thought, a lot of intellectual effort that goes into archival work. And I think historians should be better aware of it and appreciative of it and use it. Yeah. Talk to archivists, befriend archivists. It's just invaluable.
Yeah, I've often found myself giving that piece of advice to grad students going off to do research. I haven't maybe followed it myself as much as I tell them to do, but I think it's a really good thing to do. So here's a question that was in the back of my mind as well. We've talked about online access to the official records, and there are at least a couple of different ways you can access it digitally. Do you have a preferred platform for the online official records? One viewer is saying the HathiTrust could be improved a lot in terms of the interface.
Yeah, man, that is so true. I've just gotten used to accessing it through Cornell, though it's not even really with Cornell anymore, right? There are two, I think it's Ohio State and Cornell that uploaded the first versions. Yeah, you know, there are always questions. Did the OCR reader do a good enough job? Are we actually seeing everything? There are real questions. And I think that's why it is, if you're working on a particular aspect of particular time, particular place in the Civil War, do at least avail yourselves of the hard copies. You know, it's not ideal, but I still have been able to find what I needed. I'm just sort of today much more skeptical of whether I have been able to find everything that's in the OR, and of course everything that's there. It's clear to me that anytime that I'd use the OR rather than the raw records in the National Archives, I've missed maybe even the heart of the matter. I just don't know anymore what the heart of the matter is. I know what Robert N. Scott and company thought the heart of the matter was, but I don't know whether that's actually true, whether that's actually how I would see it.
Fascinating. There's a question about the number of copies that were printed and when were they printed and have they been reprinted since then?
Yeah. So this was a very fraught political issue in the late 19th century because the OR was distributed through Congress. Each congressman and each senator received a particular number of records, which changed from Congress to Congress. The rest were sold pretty much at cost plus 10%. There were always copies of single volumes lying around in the War Department that could be sold. And so at the end of the day, I have the precise numbers in the book. There are hundreds of thousands of individual volumes located, or that at least were sent out all over the US. And there were a lot of complaints that they were being distributed unevenly, that people were using connections, that there are serious complaints for Republicans in southern states saying, you know, these ex-Confederate generals here, these rebels, these traitors own a copy of the entire series, while I can't even get the volume where my company is being commended for its gallant service. And then the War Department responding to this and trying to, you know, somehow find extra volumes and asking, okay, in the Far West, for example, in 1895, are there even copies of the OR where veterans are now settling in large numbers? Are we making sure that they have access to records? It's very much in, this is again something that I did not go into it all in the talk, but is really very important for understanding this work, is that this is very much a joint effort by the War Department and veterans. The War Department could not have undertaken the work of compiling the OR without the help of veterans. And so they feel entitled to it. They feel owed volumes of the OR. And so there's this back and forth between these men about what they're owed, what the War Department can give them, when the War Department is going to reprint. But the precise numbers are in the book, and they're huge, but they were never enough. There were always people clamoring for more volumes and feeling cheated by the fact that they were unable to get any.
Yeah. And I'll paste into the chat. Hopefully everyone can see that, an Amazon link, just in case any of you are inspired. I'm sure many of you are inspired to buy the book after this fascinating conversation. We really appreciate the talk and the responses to the questions. A couple of things from me before we adjourn. The first thing to say is I hope we see you all at future events with the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. Our next webinar, we've just confirmed, is going to be on February 21st next year with Kenneth No. He's going to be speaking about his book on weather in the Civil War. So we don't yet have information about that on our website, but we will do soon. Our next in-person event is going to be in March. Our big annual event each year is the Civil War Weekend, which takes place right here at Virginia Tech. And next year, the theme is going to be the information war. So we're going to have some great talks on topics like spies, of course, but also the circulation of information among enslaved communities, Lincoln's use of the telegraph. We have a first-person portrayal of the Confederate spy Rose Greenhow to look forward to. So that's the Civil War Weekend next March. And you can find out information about that. The registration is open for the weekend. And also keep an eye on other events at our website, which is civilwar.vt.edu. And of course, we're also on Facebook and Twitter. YouTube, you can see recorded versions of our previous webinars on YouTube as well. So I hope to see you at future events. I really appreciate you spending this time with us today. We appreciate the audience questions. They were really great contributions, comments. I didn't read out all of the words of thanks, but I certainly endorse them and want to express my gratitude to Professor Sternhell for joining us and sharing your expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining and for your great questions.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.